The locks on my front door were changed. That was the first thing I noticed when I stood on the cracked stone porch of the house I had built with my own hands 30 years earlier. The home that had carried my children's first footsteps, the smell of my late wife's Sunday cooking, and the only constant in a life marked by deployments and wars in faraway deserts. But as I stood there in my uniform, duffel still slung across my shoulder, sweat cutting down my temples from the Georgia humidity, I realized something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The brass lock had been replaced by a cheap silver cylinder, new and gleaming in the sun against the faded wood. On the other side of that door, I expected the familiar silence of my empty home. Instead, muffled voices and laughter trickled through the thin walls, followed by the sound of feet running across my living room floor. Strangers were inside my house. I pounded my fist on the door, the echoes rolling down the cul-de-sac like a warning shot. After a few seconds, the door cracked open, and a young man, maybe mid-20s, bare-chested and holding a beer, leaned out. His eyes darted over my uniform, then lingered on my rank patch. He smirked as if my medals were nothing more than badges from a Boy Scouts parade. Uh, can I help you? He slurred, clearly annoyed, as though I was the intruder. This is my home, I said, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the summer air. Open the door. Behind him, I could see boxes stacked against my fireplace, a television mounted where my late wife's painting used to hang, and kids, strangers' kids, sprinting across my carpet with sticky popsicles dripping red stains into the fibers my wife once vacuumed every Saturday morning. The man gave me a lazy shrug. Nah, man, we're renting this place from the HOA, signed a 6-month lease and everything. You can take it up with them. The door slammed shut in my face. For a long moment, I just stood there, my knuckles pressed against the wood, the sound of their laughter now louder, uglier. My pulse was hammering in my ears. The air smelled of beer and cheap cologne seeping out through the cracks. An invasion of every memory I had protected with sweat, blood, and time. I stumbled backward onto the porch, staring at the flag I had raised in the front yard before I left for deployment. It was gone. In its place, a plastic "For Rent" sign leaned lazily in the flower bed, its white paint chipped, the number of the HOA management office stenciled in black. The HOA president, a 30-year-old man named Blake, who had been circling this neighborhood like a vulture since he took office, had actually done it. He'd taken my house, the one I paid for in full, and handed it over to strangers like it was some vacation rental on a beach he didn't own. My fist tightened. Every ounce of discipline drilled into me over decades of service screamed for restraint, but the betrayal burned hotter than the noon sun. How could an HOA, a group meant to protect a community, decide to sell off a soldier's home while he was away serving his country? The thought twisted in my gut until I could taste bile. My platoon brothers' faces flashed through my mind. Men who'd sworn to never leave one another behind. If they knew what had happened, they'd be here in a heartbeat. The beer-drinking tenant laughed again from inside, a sound that felt like barbed wire dragging across my chest. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over my contacts. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from rage. I was about to make a call, one that would shake this quiet neighborhood to its foundation. Because if the HOA thought they could strip me of my home while I was overseas, then they hadn't met the full strength of a platoon returning from war. I should probably start at the beginning. Before the new locks, before the strangers in my living room, before Blake ever strutted through the neighborhood like he owned it. My name is David Hayes. I'm 60 years old, a retired Army Sergeant Major. After 35 years in uniform, my body carries the scars of too many deployments, but my mind is still sharp. The house I came back to, or rather, the house I was supposed to come back to, wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was the anchor I built my life on. Back in 1990, my wife and I scraped together every dime to buy a 2-story brick house in a small gated community outside Savannah, Georgia. We painted the shutters ourselves, planted magnolia trees out front, and built a porch swing where we drink coffee in the mornings. My 2 kids grew up in that home. My wife passed away there. Every scratch on the wood floors, every dent in the old banister, it all told our family's story. The military had taken me all over the world, But that house was the one place that never changed. It was where I belonged, and it was fully paid off. No mortgage, no lien, no question about ownership. It was mine, clear and simple. That's why I thought I was safe when orders came down for another overseas deployment. I was 60, older than most men in my unit, but experience doesn't retire. They needed me in Afghanistan, and I wasn't about to turn my back on the younger soldiers counting on me. So I locked up, asked a neighbor to keep an eye on things, and left knowing my home would be waiting when I came back. That's where Blake comes in. Blake was 30 years old, the youngest HOA president our neighborhood had ever had. He was a smooth-talking realtor type, the kind of guy who wore loafers without socks and thought every conversation was a business pitch. When he moved into the neighborhood, he charmed the board with promises of increasing property values and modernizing our community. What he really meant was control, and he grabbed it with both hands. At first, it was petty stuff. Notices about my lawn needing trimming, despite my efforts to keep it tidy. Warnings about the unauthorized flagpole in my yard, even though it had been there for decades. A letter complaining about the military gear I stored in the garage, visible when the door was open. Blake was itching for a fight, but I didn't take the bait. I figured he was just a kid trying to flex his new title. But Blake didn't stop there. He started showing up unannounced, clipboard in hand, acting as if he were conducting inspections. He cornered neighbors during their evening walks, lecturing them about paint colors or mailbox height. And then he crossed a line. He knocked on my door one Saturday morning and suggested that maybe, since I was gone so much with the military, I should consider renting out my house through the HOA's new management program. I laughed in his face. I told him my home wasn't an investment property. It was the only piece of ground that ever truly belonged to me. Blake's smile tightened, and he said, "Well, just know the HOA has the authority to ensure properties are being properly utilized." I brushed it off then. I shouldn't have. Looking back, there were warning signs. At the last HOA meeting before my deployment, Blake pushed through a new bylaw about temporary occupancy rights in cases of extended vacancy. A few of us raised our eyebrows, but Blake had a way of flooding people with jargon until they nodded just to make him shut up. I didn't think much of it. I should have. When deployment orders came, I packed fast. I gave my spare keys to a retired neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who lived across the street. She'd promised to water the plants, collect my mail, and call me if anything seemed off. "Don't you worry about a thing," she told me, patting my arm. "Your home will be right here waiting." I left, and in my absence, Blake pounced. While I was leading convoys across desert roads and counting down the days until I could sit on that porch swing again, Blake filed paperwork declaring my home abandoned under extended vacancy. He convinced the board that renting it out would cover community maintenance costs. Then he signed my property into the HOA's rental pool, like it was his to give. By the time I set foot back on American soil, strangers were living in my house, paying rent directly into the HOA's bank account. My name was still on the deed, but Blake had manipulated the bylaws to give himself control. He thought I wouldn't fight back. He thought an old soldier wouldn't have the strength to stand toe-to-toe with him. But here's the thing. Blake never understood. I wasn't just one man coming back from war. I had a platoon of brothers who lived by one rule: never leave a man behind. When I told them what had happened, I saw the fire light up in their eyes. They weren't going to let my homecoming turn into a betrayal. Blake thought he had power because of his paperwork and his titles. He didn't know what power really looked like, and he was about to find out. The first night back in Savannah, I slept on Mrs. Peterson's couch across the street from my own house. I couldn't bear to get a hotel, not when strangers were sleeping in my bed and tracking beer stains across my floors. Through her lace curtains, I stared at the warm glow of my living room, now filled with people I didn't know. Every laugh, every slam of the fridge door, every muffled bass thump of their music felt like a nail driven deeper into my chest. My dog tags rested cold against my collarbone, and I gripped them tight, whispering a promise. This ends here. The next morning, I marched straight into the HOA office. Blake sat behind a mahogany desk that looked like it had been plucked out of some corporate skyscraper. He was wearing a tailored navy suit, slick back hair, grinning like he was posing for a magazine cover. "Well, look who's back," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Sergeant Hayes, right? Hope the deployment went well. I'm sure the community appreciates your service." He said the word service like it was a punchline. I kept my voice steady. "Open my house. Today. Right now." Blake laced his fingers, tapping them against his chin. "See, that's the thing. Your property was categorized under our vacancy clause. The board voted unanimously to place it in the rental program. 6-month lease, binding contract. Nothing I can do until it expires. You had no right." "It's all in the bylaws," he said smoothly, sliding a thick binder across the desk. The pages bristled with legal jargon, amendments highlighted in yellow. Section 14B, Subclause 9, Extended Vacancy Protocol. You'd be surprised how much authority an HOA really has. We're just making sure homes don't sit empty and bring down property values. Property values. That was Blake's god, his weapon, his excuse. My jaw clenched. "You rented my home while I was deployed. That's theft," he smirked. "You can call it whatever you like. But legally, the board acted within its rights. I suggest you be patient. 6 months will go by quickly." The smugness in his voice was gasoline on fire. I left before my temper could get the better of me. But that night I made a call, one that echoed through satellite phones, barracks, and halfway houses across the country. When you serve, you form bonds stronger than family. My platoon had scattered after deployment, some still active, some retired like me. But the second they heard what Blake had done, they rallied. "Say the word, Sarge," Morales said, his voice low and steady. "We've got your back." Within a week, 3 trucks pulled into Mrs. Peterson's driveway. Out stepped Morales, Diaz, and Carter. Men I'd led through firefights who trusted me with their lives. Seeing them there, boots hitting the pavement in perfect unison, I felt 20 years younger. We started small. We gathered intel the way we'd done overseas. Mrs. Peterson acted as our eyes during the day, noting comings and goings at the house. Diaz installed a tiny camera in a birdhouse across the street, recording who entered and left. Carter scoured the county property records, pulling copies of Blake's amendments and rental agreements. Morales quietly chatted up neighbors, who whispered their own frustrations with Blake's iron grip. The picture that emerged was worse than I thought. Blake had turned half the community into rentals, pocketing a percentage under the table. He bullied older residents with threats of liens and foreclosure. Anyone who pushed back got slapped with fines. Weeds too high, mailbox paint chipped, trash cans left out 5 minutes past curfew. Families were selling just to escape him. And yet nobody wanted to go on record. Blake had them scared. Meanwhile, the tenants in my house treated it like a frat den. Cars were parked across my lawn, beer bottles littered the porch, and trash piled high against the fence. One night, Morales and I watched from the shadows as Blake himself strolled up to collect a wad of cash directly from the leaseholder. He didn't even bother with receipts. "This is organized theft," Morales muttered. "And he thinks it's legal," I replied. We knew what had to come next: evidence. Without it, Blake would spin circles in legalese. With it, we could bury him. So we dug deeper. Carter traced HOA bank records through public filings. The math didn't add up. Thousands of dollars in maintenance fees, with no receipts to show where they went. Diaz intercepted emails between Blake and a property manager, discussing how to maximize occupancy turnover. Morales found half a dozen families ready to testify, if someone else went first. Still, Blake wasn't careless. He was arrogant, yes, but careful. He layered every shady move under piles of paperwork. So we baited him. One evening, I walked into the HOA meeting. The room was packed. Retirees, young families, the fearful and the frustrated. Blake stood at the podium, crisp shirt, mic in hand, running through an agenda like a politician. His eyes flicked to me, and for the briefest second, I saw it, the twitch of unease. "Mr. Hayes," he said loudly, smiling to mask it. "Glad you're back. I trust you're settling in?" I stepped forward. "I'm here to ask the board why strangers are living in my house." The room shifted. A murmur spread like a wave. Blake raised his hand, oozing calm. "As I explained to Mr. Hayes earlier, his property was classified as an extended vacancy. It was placed in the rental pool to benefit the community, perfectly within our bylaws. A neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, stood. Is that why you threatened to fine me for planting roses outside the approved color scheme? Benefit the community? Another voice piped up. And why do our fees keep going up when half the neighborhood is rented out? Blake's jaw tightened. Let's stay on topic. I didn't back down. Topic's simple. You stole my home, and I'm not leaving this time. The tension was electric. Blake tapped his gavel, trying to rein it in. This meeting is adjourned. But I'd already seen it. The cracks forming, neighbors whispering, glancing at one another, realizing maybe they weren't alone in their anger. That night, Morales said, "He's losing control. He knows it. We just need the kill shot." And fate handed it to us a week later. Diaz's birdhouse camera caught Blake carrying documents out of his office late at night, stuffing them into a duffel, loading them into his trunk. We intercepted him at the community dumpster, torching HOA files. Among the ashes, we pulled half-burned rental agreements, proof of illegal subletting, cash kickbacks, even personal notes scribbled in Blake's handwriting. It was enough to sink him. But I wanted more. Because this wasn't just about exposing Blake. It was about reclaiming my home in front of every single person he had bullied. And so, with my platoon at my side, we set the stage for a confrontation Blake would never forget. The boardroom was packed wall to wall, folding chairs scraped against the tile, neighbors squeezed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with whispers and the faint smell of burnt coffee. Blake had called an emergency HOA session after rumors of misinformation started spreading, but I knew the truth. He wanted to reassert control. He wanted to remind everyone who ran this neighborhood. He didn't know he was walking straight into an ambush. Morales stood by the back wall, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd like we were back on Overwatch. Diaz had his laptop wired to the projector, waiting for my signal. Carter carried a folder thicker than a phone book. Documents we'd pieced together from burnt scraps, public filings, and statements from neighbors too scared to come forward alone. And me? I sat front and center, dead staring at the podium where Blake adjusted his tie, smiling like a senator about to give a victory speech. He tapped the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. There's been a lot of confusion lately, fueled by, frankly, a few disgruntled voices, about the HOA's rental management program. Let me be clear. Every action taken has been within the bylaws. Our goal has always been to preserve property values and protect this community. The crowd shifted uneasily. A few people clapped. Most didn't. I stood. You mean stealing homes and pocketing cash? Gas rippled. Blake's smile froze for a fraction of a second, then snapped back in place. Mr. Hayes, always so direct. But again, as I've explained, your property was placed under extended vacancy. Everything above board, nothing illegal. I raised my hand. Signal enough. Diaz dimmed the lights and the projector screen flickered to life. Grainy black and white footage appeared. Blake, under the glow of a street lamp, shoving HOA documents into a duffel bag, then dumping them into a fire behind the office dumpster. The room collectively inhaled. Blake slammed his gavel. Out of order. Diaz cued the next slide. Copies of the charred contracts, reconstructed and highlighted. Names, dates, signatures, cash transactions. Every page dripped with fraud. Carter stepped forward, his voice steady. Independent auditor confirms embezzlement of over $80,000 in community funds, rental kickbacks, illegal subletting, extortion through fines. He dropped the folder onto the board table with a thud that echoed like a hammer on steel. The room erupted. Shouts, gasps, neighbors turning to one another with wide eyes. Blake pounded the podium, veins bulging in his neck. This is slander. These men are not even board members. They have no standing here. I stepped into the aisle. Standing? Let me show you standing. I pulled a crisp document from my pocket and held it up. This is the deed to my house. Paid in full, 30 years ago. My wife's name is on it. You had no right to rent it out while I was deployed overseas. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Mrs. Peterson rose from the back. Her voice, frail but sharp, cut through the room. He told me I could be fined if I watered your plants, David. He threatened me for helping a soldier's home. Others followed. Mrs. Callahan, the Ramirez family. One by one, voices rose, stories spilling, intimidation, threats, money disappearing. The crowd turned like a tide, all eyes on Blake. And then Morales, who'd been quiet until now, stepped up beside me. His broad shoulders squared, his voice like gravel. We served with this man. We fought wars with him, and we don't leave our own behind. If you think you can take his home while he's risking his life for this country, you've got another thing coming. The applause was thunderous. Chairs rattled as neighbors rose to their feet. The sound wasn't just approval, it was a breaking dam. Fear was gone. Blake's mask cracked, his smile twisted into a snarl. You think you can threaten me? I am this community. Without me, your property values. Without you, I cut him off. This community finally breathes free. I nodded to Diaz. The final slide clicked on screen, a live video feed. County sheriff deputies stood outside the HOA office doors, arms folded. They pushed through, badges gleaming. Blake Carter, one deputy announced, you're under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and illegal seizure of property. The room went dead silent, then burst into shouts as Blake tried to bolt. But he didn't get far. Morales and Carter stepped in front of him, not touching, just standing tall. The deputies closed in, cuffing him as neighbors gawked, some filming on their phones. The gavel fell from Blake's hand, clattering across the floor. For the first time, his voice shook. You can't do this. I'll sue all of you. You don't understand, but nobody listened. The crowd roared as deputies hauled him out. For once, Blake's smooth words failed him. His power evaporated in the very room he thought he owned. I looked around at the faces, relieved, angry, empowered. Mrs. Peterson is dabbing tears. Kids stared wide-eyed at the spectacle. My platoon stood beside me like sentinels. And then, for the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe. Because my home wasn't just mine again. It was ours. The days after Blake's arrest felt like a fog finally lifting over the neighborhood. For years, people had walked with their shoulders hunched, whispering complaints but too afraid to raise their voices. Now front yards blossomed with conversation. Neighbors who had barely waved at one another before were stopping in the street, trading stories, swapping relief. The wait was gone. The sheriff's office confirmed what we already knew. Blake had been running a racket, over $120,000 siphoned into shell accounts. Illegal rentals disguised as temporary occupancy. Personal vacations are charged as community development. He'd built his empire on fear, and once that fear cracked, everything tumbled down. The board voted unanimously to remove him. In his place, a temporary council of volunteers stepped in. People who actually lived here, who cared about more than a balance sheet. For the first time, I saw Mrs. Callahan smiling as she planted her roses without worrying about a fine. The Ramirez kids rode bikes in the cul-de-sac without their parents, scanning for Blake's car. The community was ours again. As for me, the first night I slept in my own bed again, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, feeling the quiet hum of home settle back around me. The smell of old pine floors, the creak of the stairwell, even the faint whistle of wind against the shutters. It was all mine again. Not rented, not stolen. Mine. But there was something else too, a realization. I had fought wars overseas, seen men stand shoulder to shoulder in deserts and mountains, risking everything for each other. And here, back home, the fight was no less real. Property, dignity, the right to come home to the life you built. Blake thought he could strip those things away with paperwork and arrogance. But justice doesn't belong to titles. It belongs to people willing to stand together. When I walked across the street to thank Mrs. Peterson for sheltering me, she hugged me tight. David, she whispered, you reminded us all what courage looks like. We were waiting for someone to stand first. You did. I shook my head. We stood together. That's what broke him. And she was right. Courage isn't just about charging into battle. Sometimes it's about planting roses, even when you're told not to. Sometimes it's about a platoon showing up in trucks when one of their own is hurting. Sometimes it's about a community finding its voice again. Months later at the county courthouse, I watched Blake shuffle in wearing an orange jumpsuit, chains clinking at his wrists. The man who once strutted like he owned everything now couldn't meet a single eye in the room. He pleaded guilty to fraud, embezzlement, and illegal seizure of property. He was sentenced to 10 years, with restitution payments to every family he'd drained. When the judge read the sentence, a murmur of satisfaction swept through the gallery. It wasn't vengeance, it was balanced, finally restored. Afterward, Carter slapped me on the back. "Guess you got your home back the hard way, Sarge." I smiled. Wouldn't be the first time. We laughed, but beneath it was something deeper. The bond of men who knew that home is worth fighting for, whether it's a patch of sand overseas or a porch swing in Georgia. Now when I sit on that swing with a cup of coffee, I don't just see magnolias and hear morning birds. I see a neighborhood that learned to rise. I see a flag that flies without anyone threatening to tear it down. I see a house that will never again be reduced to property value by someone who never earned it. Most of all, I feel the quiet weight of victory. Not in the sense of winning a war, but in reclaiming dignity. Because in the end, that's what Blake never understood. My house wasn't just a building. It was memory, sacrifice, love, and loss stitched into every corner. It was proof of a life lived with honor. And that can't be rented. That can't be stolen. That can't be sold. It can only be defended. And when the day came, we defended it. Together. Justice isn't just about courts and handcuffs. Justice is neighbors finding their voices, families reclaiming peace, and a soldier finally coming home to the place he swore he'd never abandon. For me, it wasn't just about taking my house back. It was about proving that dignity and freedom are worth fighting for, whether on foreign soil or in your own backyard. And that's the story I'll carry until my last breath. The day an HOA thought it could steal my home, and my platoon, my brothers, came back to take it with me.